I wanted to say that we will have time for questions and answers after all three panelists. Thank you, Maurice. Our next panelist is Darakshan Raja. She's co-director of the Washington Peace Center and the Helga Hurst Organizing Fellow, providing grassroots support to local movements. She's the co-founder of the Muslim American Women's Policy Forum, a collective of Muslim women and women of color allies that work at the intersection of state violence and gender justice. She serves on the board for the API Domestic Violence Resource Project in D.C. Darakshan.
Hi, everybody. My apologies. So I actually wanted to talk more about anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia in this current moment. But before that, I do want to contextualize and position. We're talking about war, militarism, and so forth, and we're in Washington, D.C., which is actually the most militarized jurisdiction in the entire country. In addition to that, it's important to note that the war that we sometimes talk about as happening abroad is actually happening right here. So how many of you know the name of Justin Carr? Raise your hand. One person, Reese? Anybody else? Right. So that speaks to the ways in which our movement, the anti-war movement, has a blind side. Justin Carr is the protester in Charlotte who actually died yesterday. And if any of you were watching the images out of Charlotte, last night I stayed up late watching what was happening. To me, that is a war zone. For the National Guard to be deployed at individuals, community members who are just asking for transparency, accountability, and justice for the murder of people, and to be responded to by tear gas, by pepper balls, by riot and riot gear, we're not talking about policing responses anymore or justice responses. We're talking about a paramilitary, military force responding to everyday people. So let's remember that. The other thing I want to say is, since we are in Washington, D.C., and particularly American University, so there was an interesting study that came out that talked about particularly the complicity of universities in the military-industrial complex. Guess what? American University ranked pretty high, and many of the colleges in D.C. actually do. And so I want us to remember that when we talk about war and we talk about these issues, to not otherize and put it over there. To remember that it is local, it is happening right here. The tactics that we're seeing now in local communities, just right in D.C., the Metropolitan Police Department uses the practices of jump outs taken from the IDF in protests, the kind of responses we've seen from particularly the Department of Homeland Security fusion centers, which we know that the Department of Homeland Security was created right after 9/11 to, quote unquote, find the domestic terrorist and the domestic threat here. Well, today, those fusion centers that were supposed to be deployed to take care of national security issues around big terrorist attacks and also environmental issues, big disasters, are being turned on protesters and activists right here. And I had the misfortune of actually having a vigil that I organized a few months ago to really create solidarity between Black Muslim communities, but at a point to honor the Black women, girls, trans folks that had been murdered, and found out later in the intercept that the vigil we held, again, a mourning space, was actually being watched by the DHS Fusion Center. And so we talk about racialization, racism, and war. Again, it's right here. It's happening in this moment. So I wanted to start with that. The other thing I want to start with is that I know you talked about the Congo. I think it's important to note that the strategy of the United States, particularly empire, let's call it what it is, and the basis of America, understanding that we're a settler colonial state. It's built on the genocide of the indigenous communities. It's built upon the slave trade. It's built upon white supremacy. And so that logic is very much what is part of the US's empire and how it has actually ruled globally. We're we're talking about the assassination of Lumumba, well, we know that was part and strategy of also COINTELPRO, which specifically targeted Black liberation leaders, but as well as anti-war folks, indigenous rights, the Chicano movement, all these different pieces. And so, again, what is happening abroad is happening right here. And so we have to be really intentional, again, to not create these fissures and divides, which then end up really hurting us and also hurt the solidarities that can be engaged and emerged. The other thing I want to talk about is particularly, again, Islamophobia. And the reason I want to bring that up is because we have a presidential candidate who is running. I will name him because we all know who this is, Trump, who specifically used anti-Muslim racism. He compared Syrian refugees to Skittles by saying, here's a bowl of Skittles. Would you want these bowl of Skittles if you knew 3 of them were actually going to kill you? Comparing that to basically Syrian refugees. He's also said other stories such as, again, to his base about some woman taking in a snake with a baby or something, and the snake being basically the Syrian refugees that were so nice and welcoming to all these people, and they're going to turn on us and attack us. Of course, that entire positioning and context is not talking about the U.S. involvement in creating these conditions. It does not talk about the role of the U.S. in for many, many decades being involved in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia, Central Asia, really being this intervention that prevents people from really getting their liberation. And so we know that so much of U.S. militarism, the way it's built, is to not have people their self-determination. And also in a context where colonization has still extended itself, the U.S. has so much after World War II continued to play a role in really extending that. And so I think the other thing is we are in a state of war right now with a specific community. When we talk about Muslim communities, it's important not to talk about the treatment, the hate violence that Muslims experience domestically, and not connect it, again, since post 9/11 with the institutionalization of the war on terror. And so since then, we've had at least 1.2 million Muslims killed. We know that is very much an undercounting. We know that more than 7 Muslim majority nations have been bombed. This has continued whether it is under Bush or the Obama administration. And so sometimes we tend to think of, quote unquote, the conservatives or Republicans as being the ones that are racist, but really give a pass to, I think, liberal and progressives who engage in racism as well. And so it's continued. And I think under Obama, one of the things to think about is just in the last year, the number, there's, I think, at least 1 million. Well, let me actually take the numbers out so I'm actually quoting it right. So in terms of, just in the previous year, we're talking about in Iraq, at least 3 million people killed. In Afghanistan, 220,000 killed. In Pakistan, 80,000 killed. And so, again, when we talk about these communities, do we mention them? Do we bring them up? Absolutely not. And we also don't see how that being at a war with quote-unquote Muslims, how that is then projected onto the Muslim communities within the United States. The hate violence that is being experienced, the domestic surveillance apparatus that has been continuously increased on Muslim communities. In addition, I think that, of course, at this point, when we talk about Muslim communities, Muslim majority countries are not the only one, of course, under U.S., the arm of U.S. imperialism. We have over 800 bases across the entire world. There is at least some military presence for over 160 countries. So again, when we talk about empire, this is not just empire saying it up here, but there's a very real, concrete way that the U.S. is involved. And I think, again, there's a certain blueprint. It happened during the dirty wars that we used in Central America that we're seeing in parts like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, where you see the United States really going in and under the guise of aid. Let's even talk about the politics of aid, which is too often military aid. And what they do is they train the military, they train quote-unquote paramilitary forces, who then turn that apparatus on labor movements, on people, lands rights issues, gender justice issues, and so forth. north. So again, comparing that, if we really want to get rid of this war in a global context, we also got to call in the fact that we're living in a prison industrial complex right here. So for us to be the leading jailer ever in history, and knowing that that has specifically been done on the bodies of Black and brown people, is again connecting both of those pieces, very much so. And then the other thing I want to talk about is particularly at this point, the expansion of anti-Muslim racism and some specific policies. So one of the things that the White House a few years put out called the Countering Violent Extremism programs, that is something that is being used particularly to say, pretty much equate the Muslim identity and how Muslims show up to somehow being prone to being violent, which again is important to note because that means that anyone who shows up as a Muslim, and that's just not a faith-based identity necessarily, but even calling to question empire, power, post-war on terror issues is seen through the lens of that you are prone to being an extremist or you're prone to being a terrorist. And what has the United States government done? It is working with health departments, social workers. The FBI launched a program in particularly schools all across the country called How to Not Be a Puppet. So just imagine that even in spaces where you would go to your school, your health professional, even community spaces, that's actually does not really exist in the same way. Someone is looking at you first through the lens of a terrorist before they actually center your humanity. And I think that when we talk about racialization of Muslim, the term, particularly the construction of Muslim as a terrorist, has been such a lethal force for not allowing for communities to have empathy for us, to have solidarity for us. Every single time that I bring up these numbers, these casualties, we talk about as collateral damage. Imagine me sitting here and saying the names of millions of people. We wouldn't have enough time. But the reason that it's able to be dismissed so quickly is because people will bring up ISIS, they will bring up 9/11, they will bring up terrorists. And so the only lens that they want to see the Muslim community through is the lens of, again, being a terrorist. And so being really thoughtful about why is it that it is with Muslim communities that collective punishment and that collective blame happens when we know with Dylan Roof, for example, all white people, all white men are not being picked up and targeted. So why is it that with Muslim communities we're being targeted in this way? And again, it's been 15 years from 9/11. We know that the war on terror did not start on 9/11. It had been happening even before then. The U.S. has been involved for a while. But that it's at this moment, structural Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism is very much working in tandem with anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee hatred. These systems are then keeping each other far more resilient, and it's harder to organize against them because the state has multiple tactics that you're actually getting at. So it's not just local communities where you're being criminalized, you're actually being seen as a national security threat. And for many of us, as someone who's Pakistani, who works with a lot of folks who are Pakistani as well, who are, who identify as Arab as well, is that we are seen as the perpetual foreigner. And the perpetual foreigner, so it doesn't matter really if you've been born in this country or not, people automatically assume that you're not American and that you're not from here. And not just that you're not from here, you're not American, but actually look at you through the lens of being suspicious. So what are you doing here? That foreign war threat has come right here domestically. And so we can't look at you in a way that is trusting. And interesting just what happened earlier this week in New York City with the Abdul Rahimi case is that New York City sent out a mass text actually in the morning to everybody. And the text that they sent out, pretty scary, said things such as, it doesn't matter if you know your Muslim neighbor for 30 years, this might be someone quite suspicious. And so many Muslim men, young Muslim men who are Afghani, Pakistani, Iraqi, whatever, have names like Ahmed and Khan, which, by the way, is a pretty common name in the Muslim community. It's like, I don't know, Bill or Bob or something. But for that to happen and to read the stories of some of the men who were talking about that they were so afraid to be on the subway or in the metro, and to look up and have people get this mass text and in the moment feel that fear of being profiled. So again, in this war on terror technology, things continue to escalate. And so I think we should be watching that and watching also how that technology is being applied in this moment to the various movements that are actually emerging in this country, from the movement for Black Lives to the Dreamers, to also Muslims who are organizing right now in Minnesota, the Black Muslim community, particularly from Somalia and so forth, who bear the brunt of really anti-Blackness, anti-Muslim racism, as well as xenophobia, are organizing against these policies and are truly very, I think, at risk in terms of being targeted. So I think just as the anti-war movement, or those of you who are concerned, are part of this, it's really important, again, to remember how communities are being impacted by that violence right here, and then making those transnational connections. The other thing I'll say is that someone, again, who identifies as brown, as immigrant, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges within the anti-war movement. For a very long time, in showing up in spaces, to see a predominantly white space really felt too often as if, where are my people in this? And then to hear from certain folks the saviorism that they had, the assumptions that they had, and not to think about that people within the anti-war movement also need to be watching their own anti-Blackness, their Islamophobia, their own racism, because without that, you're not going to create the inclusive space that's actually going to open these doors to so many more people who will feel engaged, who will want to be here. And so I think just thinking about that. The other thing I see a lot in the anti-war movement is that folks want the answer. Folks are like, well, what do you want us to do? I think that part of American privilege and part of what we have been so accustomed to is that we have the answers to everything in the world, and we don't. Part of what we now need to do is actually take leadership directly impacted communities, but also call in our institutions. So I don't necessarily think that if we don't dismantle anti-Blackness in America, I do not believe we are ever going to be able to get rid of militarization or the violence or the extrajudicial killing of my people, whether it's in Pakistan or the Pathans that are in Afghanistan. It's not going to happen. And so really making those links and being a little bit more humble in the way we approach this work in the anti-war work, that we're not saving anybody. If anything, we're actually saving ourselves, because America cannot continue in the way it is. And that we are guilty and complicit in structures of imperialism and violence, whether, no matter how aware you are, no matter how much you're resisting, if you're paying your taxes or you're even part of this apparatus, you're funding a military infrastructure. Yeah, and I think that beyond that, again, I hope that we can have those difficult conversations internally as well, to call in also our own racism, our own biases, our own Islamophobia. Why is it? I've gone to so many anti-war conferences on Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan, and I see all white men speaking. That actually, in very ways, is actually reaffirming that system of white supremacy. And so I think really also calling ourselves in this space and like just looking around and seeing, why aren't more people of color here, even though you're in Washington, D.C., which is a majority people of color city, by the way. And so just thinking about that, I think if we are not going to have those conversations, then this movement is going to die down. And the consequences and the people who are paying the heaviest price, I think we owe it to ourselves as well as to the guilt that the systems we're complicit in, to actually change the approach that we have to this work. So thank you so much for listening to me.